Well, thanks for being here. Unfortunately, I wish we were here under better circumstances, but as you know, the state has found itself with the Feeding Our Future program embroiled in the largest fraud scandal in state history. And our governor has now lied to the public multiple times about his involvement in that fraud scandal. It has been 270 days since the public first learned of the Feeding Our Future fraud scandal, and 34 days since U.S. Attorney Andy Lugar announced indictments in the case. But we still have remarkably few answers about the critical decisions made by Governor Walz, his administration, and the Attorney General's office, who provided legal counsel to the Minnesota Department of Education. It's been more than 2 weeks since Governor Walz gave 3 different answers to the very simple question, when did he first learn about the fraud? And I'll remind you that that very simple question that he gave 3 different answers to was on day 9 of the scandal. So the administration obviously has things to hide. It's troubling that no one seems to have followed up on the interview done by the Minnesota reformer. It's a key question, but Governor Walz has been allowed to evade answering it directly by avoiding interviews with all of you. I can tell you from talking to Minnesotans at the doors over the past few weeks that they're upset by the Walz fraud scandal. They don't feel like they've gotten the answers they deserve about the $250 million that was stolen from taxpayers, much of which we'll likely never get back. They don't accept the ridiculous notion that the Attorney General can't answer questions about the scandal because of attorney-client privilege. That does not exist in this case. The Walz administration and Attorney General Ellison would like you all to believe that the Walz fraud scandal is something they should be applauded for, that they did such a great job because they cooperated with the FBI investigation that began nearly a year after the fraud was first suspected. We're here today to highlight the massive failures by Governor Walz and Attorney General to stop this fraud that they knew was ongoing. They had at least 5 different opportunities to turn off the funding to this group. Instead, in each case, they simply let criminals continue stealing our tax dollars for months on end. The first of those 5 off-ramps was the stipulation agreement. In December of 2020, and maybe I should give you a little background on this. Our staff did an immense amount of work digging into all of the documents, hours and hours spent reading through all of the court documents, all of the news stories, all of the statements by the governor, anything that we could get our hands on. And it actually, when you get into it, is somewhat disgusting. The first off-ramp is the stipulation agreement. In December of 2020, the Walz administration signed a stipulation agreement with Feeding Our Future. Why was this stipulation agreement important? The stipulation agreement legally bound MDE to approve or deny site applications and to provide assistance to an organization they knew was fraudulent to resolve applications that otherwise would have been denied. If Governor Walz and the Department of Education knew this group was fraudulent, which we know they did based on several public statements from the governor and his commissioner, why on earth would you sign a legally binding stipulation agreement and continue processing applications rather than continue the legal battle, which likely would have proceeded to an evidentiary hearing where they could have raised concerns about this fraud in court and brought that evidence into the court? That question has yet to be clearly answered by the governor, the commissioner, or the attorney general. And it is a question all of you should be working to answer. The second off-ramp is the material breach of contract. In January of 2021, the Minnesota Department of Education advised the court in their first amended response to the lawsuit that Feeding Our Future was in material breach of contract. I don't pretend to be a lawyer, but a material breach of contract is considered the most serious breach of contract in contract law and would have been enough to terminate their relationship with Feeding Our Future entirely if they wanted to. But the Walz administration didn't even try to go that route. They let the fraud continue for months and let criminals walk away with hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, instead of aggressively enforcing the breach of contract and putting legal pressure on Feeding Our Future. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ann New-Brindley to cover a couple more.
Excellent. The next off-ramp, the first one I will address, is site visits and conducting site visits. I'm going to take you back to 2020, and you will recall, I mean, we all know we were in the middle of the pandemic. It was a difficult time. And you might remember at that time the amount of effort the Walz administration was spending on site visits. Not site visits to food sites, mind you, but site visits to restaurants and businesses. The governor and attorney general spent a significant amount of time, energy, and resources sending out government workers to harass business owners, handing out ticky-tacky violations for violations like a waiter's mask being slightly beneath his nose or tables not being exactly 6 feet apart. The governor's administration was doing lots of site visits like this on business and restaurant owners. However, MDE did not have to send employees in harm's way. They could have easily sat alone, masked, in a car, socially distanced from this, to see if indeed 5,000 children or parents were visiting these sites. This would not have taken master detective work, right? This is not difficult. This is basic due diligence on behalf of the taxpayers whose dollars they're supposed to be safeguarding. But the Walz administration didn't do that. There is literally no evidence whatsoever that anyone from the Walz administration visited a single site to see if kids were being fed. Not a single site visit. They acted as if they were powerless to do their fiduciary duty to Minnesota taxpayers, letting government workers harass businesses while doing nothing to thwart the criminals who were stealing $250 million. $250 million right under their noses. I want to be really clear. If they had discovered evidence of fraud, Judge Guthman, the FDA, and others have made clear that they could have stopped this madness. In a related off-ramp to site visits, the Walz administration could have done a review of financial records. So under state law, the Attorney General and MDE, they both had authority to demand bank records from Feeding Our Future. These bank records would have made the fraud immediately clear and given the Walz administration immediate actionable evidence to turn over to law enforcement to put a stop to this months earlier. But they didn't do that. Why didn't they do that? We still don't know. But here's a quote from the FBI search warrant from January in 2022, so January of this year. This is what the FBI search warrant said. It said, MDE did not have access to the participating company's bank records, so was unable to conclusively determine whether they were misappropriating federal child nutrition program funds. To be clear, they didn't have access because they didn't ask for them. Under the law, both MDE and the Attorney General absolutely had access to those documents, but they failed to exercise their legal authority despite knowing that fraud was ongoing. Sort of the last off-ramp that we're going to address is just stop funding the fraud. They could have done this at any point. So my last point. Governor Walz made Minnesotans believe for several months that he had been ordered by a judge to continue payments. Well, of course, we all know at this point that that was not true. He was not. We know that Governor Walz lied to the public about that. All he had to do was stop funding the fraud. He had to just force the issue in the courts, not by arguing technicalities, but by sounding the alarm, bringing forward evidence of fraud and slamming the door shut on this scam. But not once did they take that approach. At every turn, Governor Walz backed down and voluntarily resumed payments. They could have come forward publicly much earlier and in a much more public way to make direct allegations about the fraud they knew was happening. They want us to believe that the FBI investigation tied their hands. But the FBI investigation came well after hundreds of millions of dollars had been stolen. Well after. The damage was done, but they continued sort of this half-baked legal strategy, offering these technical arguments in court and never actually bringing concerns about fraud to the court. In fact, in a deposition in July of 2021, so July of last year, after the FBI investigation was underway, MDE staff testified under oath that they had no reason to suspect fraud by Feeding Our Future. Well, which is it? Did the governor know in 2020 when he tells us he knew, or did they have no idea? There are so many unanswered questions here that the people of Minnesota deserve to know. They could have worked with Senators Tina Smith or Amy Klobuchar to intervene directly with the USDA to shut this down in its tracks. They could have taken this to law enforcement months earlier. Why did they wait until April of 2021 to contact the FBI? The Walz administration danced around these fraud allegations publicly and in legal battle, but never forcing the issue and never sounding the alarm. Governor Walz could have held a press conference declaring that they were shutting off payments to an organization they believed to be fraudulent. They could have stopped this months earlier. They didn't. They stayed silent, they delayed, they let criminals walk away with $250 million that belonged to the people of Minnesota. And with that, I'm going to turn the time back over to Leader Dowd.
So there are still significant unanswered questions about this case, and Minnesotans deserve answers. The Senate has held multiple hearings, conducted an investigation, and issued an interim report. House Democrats have not held a single hearing and refused to do even basic oversight work to get to the bottom of those questions. Not only that, multiple prominent Democrats have documented direct ties to the scandal. One lawmaker intervened directly on behalf of one of the nonprofits linked to an indicted fraudster. The brother, in another case, the brother of a Democrat state representative has a direct link to the scandal, and the wife of a Minneapolis city council member has a direct link to the scandal. It's been literally weeks since Governor Walz has answered direct questions from the media on this. I would urge you to keep digging and make sure that Minnesotans get the answers that they're entitled to. I will say, as we have looked into this, it's very obvious that the Walz administration has not taken this issue seriously, and that now for the last 2 and 3 weeks, that they have been intentionally trying to dodge the press and dodge any questions about this. On day 9 of the scandal, they gave 3 different answers within a 24-hour period on when they knew that this was a scandal and that it was fraudulent. We think that that's unacceptable. We think, number one, the governor needs to answer, when did he know there was fraud? And then ultimately today, we have identified at least 5 opportunities where the governor could have stopped payment to this organization, and he failed to do so. So the second question is, why didn't you stop paying out this money after you knew this program was fraudulent? And the governor needs to answer those questions. The public is demanding it. And with that, we'll take some questions.
How about something not on the chart is where the money starts? Because the beginning, the genesis is the federal government, is the Trump administration.
Well,
USDA waived requirements as well. So does some of the onus fall on the federal government?
you know, this is another thing that irritated me, and we've all been around this place, and we understand spin and we understand politics. I knew right away when Governor Walz came out and said, well, this is just a federal program, right? He gave the Heisman reach to this is somebody else's problem. I was the one that uncovered the fraud. No, this was federal money that was given to the state of Minnesota, and the Walz administration awarded the grant to this fraudulent organization. Did they do the due diligence to find out if this organization could carry out the actual program that they were bidding on? Or Did they just look the other way because they were busy investigating businesses who were doing their best to try to make it through COVID and survive? And the reality is, the governor owns this. The governor's administration awarded this grant to this organization. Did they do the due diligence? And then once they realized there was fraud, and it looks like they knew within about a month that there was fraud, according to their own accounts, why didn't they stop payment? But $250 million of taxpayer money was paid out after the Walz administration says they knew this was fraudulent. We need answers.
USDA, though? USDA also did waive their requirements too, not just Walz and the stay-at-home order.
Well, let's be clear, though. I mean, the requirements they waived, you know, they extended timelines. They did things like this. The USDA certainly was never okay with paying out $250 million fraudulently. I mean, to blame this on the federal level, the reality is the feds gave the state of Minnesota money. The feds gave the state of Minnesota money to make sure that kids were being fed when they weren't in school. Let's not lose sight of that. This money was supposed to make sure kids were fed when they were not in school. And the USDA extended some deadlines and things like this, and we're gonna say, therefore, the Department of Education had no culpability. Clearly, the Walz administration was fine with doing site visits. They were doing site visits on these other organizations. They were doing site visits on our businesses and restaurant owners. Why weren't they doing site visits on these approved sites for Feeding Our Future?
Because there was a federal waiver. Weren't you electing a federal waiver?
Here, let me step in here. I got this one. Thank you for asking that question. I do appreciate the opportunity. If the Walz administration knew this program was fraudulent, which they are saying that they did, they couldn't make a single site visit? It'd be pretty obvious that a site was not feeding 5,000 kids a day. Somebody parked in their car could sit outside and just watch how many people were coming and going from this building. Okay, it's one thing to say that the USDA or whoever waived the necessity for site visits, but don't you think that the Walz administration has enough common sense to know after they say they knew this program was fraudulent, that they could send somebody out just to check? There is not one shred of evidence that anyone ever checked in 2 years, $250 million?
There's 3 visits. There were 3 site visits to feed the And did they catch it? My point is that you said there were none, but the records show there were at least 3 site visits.
So when they made those site visits, did they catch the fraud? Did they find out that it was fraudulent?
Well, I'm just wondering if you're correcting your answer or if you're standing by 0.
There's no evidence that they made a site visit that caught any fraud. And it seems to me that if they actually had made a site visit, they would have caught the fraud, right? We're talking about 5,000 kids per site, 5,000 kids per day per site. Should be evidence that 5,000 kids were either showing up or they weren't. Now it looks like they weren't at all. So if they made site visits, they've got more questions to answer than they did before, which is how did you not uncover the fraud if you were making 3 site visits?
If there was some cover-up, what was the motive for that?
I have speculated about that, and I don't know that it's my job necessarily to speculate, but one of 2 things is true. Either they didn't know there was fraud and now they're lying about it and trying to take credit for something they didn't know about, or they knew there was fraud but took no action to stop it. Either one is bad. Either one, they are lying to the public, and they got caught lying to the public.
How did they take no action knowing that there was a problem?
Then my guess is maybe the first one is true. Maybe they didn't really know, but they're saying so confidently that they did know there was fraud. I mean, how many times has the governor said that he knew there was fraud, right? I mean, the governor told me during the last legislative session about this program and that he knew there was fraud. That was when it was in court.
Commissioner Mueller said it was evident after 1 month.
Yeah, Commissioner Mueller's on record saying after 1 month, they knew that this program was fraudulent. After 1 month.
Are there legislative responses that you're preparing for next session, whether or not you're in the majority, like bills? I mean, some of this is a pandemic-specific situation, it seems like, but like additional checks, other legislation, like things to prevent, looks at other pandemic programs, closer looks by the legislature.
I'm glad that you asked about that, because I think we also lose sight of the fact that the Office of the Legislative Auditor just came out with a report saying with the homelessness money, there is no record keeping with the money that was the hundreds of millions of dollars that were given out in homelessness money. Now, the commissioner assures us that that was all used legitimately, but I'm not sure how she knows that, because there is no documentation. There's no documentation. So frankly, from the perspective of the legislature, it is absurd to us that we somehow need to micromanage these agencies to ensure they are doing the job that they are supposed to be doing. But frankly, if we have to legislate site visits, then we're gonna have to do that. If we have to legislate these things, we'll have to do that. But certainly there is a place legislatively to ensure that grants going out from the state of Minnesota, that taxpayer money includes accountability. That when we give money from the state of Minnesota, there should always be accountability for that money. Who is being served? How are they being served? What is their success rate? All of these questions need to be answered. And again, when government money is involved, government accountability should be involved. And that's the red flag here. There was no government accountability with overseeing the largest fraud scandal in the state of Minnesota history.
The Attorney
I
General
want to chime in on this one, just one second.
The Attorney General said that if they had blown the whistle sooner, that would have alerted the fraudsters to the fact that they knew what they were up to. And there was
They wouldn't have gotten the
gather
money?
these evidence and catch them with the
So
goods.
bizarre.
Just like if you were busting a drug ring, you would want to catch them with the dope in your hands.
I'm okay with that. I'm okay with catching the fraud as early as possible and stopping it and preventing $250 million of taxpayer money going out the door. I think it's inexcusable for anybody to try to defend that they knew about this 2 years ago and didn't take any action when we've outlined at least 5 different opportunities where they could have stopped the payments from going out the door. And they would have still had a paper trail and financial records which could have led to indictments. It's inexcusable to think that somebody would allow this to go on for 2 years because they needed it. If they knew a month in that this was fraudulent, they could have captured those financial records and stopped the payments and then gone back and prosecuted the people who were guilty. But the problem is because they let it go on, it got bigger and bigger. And it probably got worse and involved more people after it went on and on. So back to the original question about what sort of legislative action. I'll remind you that this money came into the state of Minnesota during COVID with a lot of other federal money. So this is $250 million out of what potentially could be as much as $10 billion of money that went out of this state's coffers that came from the federal government, but ultimately was paid out by the state of Minnesota without legislative approval. So our caucus was on record during all of COVID saying, this is not what our Chapter 12 emergency powers legislation ever envisioned or imagined would happen. And we believe that all of this money needs to have legislative oversight. We believe that it all needs to be appropriated by the legislature. That would have and potentially could have prevented this.
Is that something you're messaging at the door? Somebody mentioned door knocking, that you're hearing this. Obviously, this is very complex and layered, but how much is it coming up? What do you message? What are you hearing at the door?
You know, I think one of the biggest issues I've been in the legislature 12 years now, one of the biggest issues that always is polls at the top is waste, fraud, and abuse. This is always an issue that just makes Minnesotans' blood boil. They can't understand how things like this can happen and how nobody can catch it. And it's not, it's one thing when you have to pay $1 a gallon more for gas, but when $250 million goes out the door of taxpayer dollars that's completely fraudulent and nobody caught it for 2 years, that's inexcusable. And Minnesota.
Enough to change minds, swing districts. You really thought you had a good shot
Well,
at the House, then maybe look closer. I mean, is it going to affect maybe control of the chamber?
I don't know that it does that. We're very confident about taking back the majority in the House. The numbers have moved our way significantly in the last 2 and 3 weeks. The reality is this is bigger than an election. This is our government and whether or not Minnesotans have trust and faith in the way that that government operates. And unfortunately, our governor has lied to Minnesotans multiple times now, and that's documented. He lied to Minnesotans multiple times about his involvement in the largest fraud scandal in state history and the largest COVID fraud scandal in the entire country. This is a big deal, right? This is not something that the governor can brush under the rug. I can't believe that he thinks for the last 2 weeks he cannot appear before the press and not answer a single question about this when there's a lot of questions that need answers. And the fact that he didn't have his story straight on day 9 of the scandal and gave 3 different answers in a 24-hour period about when he knew that this was fraudulent, the governor could have prevented this. Every indication, including his own commissioner's statement that they knew this was fraudulent a month into the program. The governor could have stopped this 5 different ways, at least, and there may be many more. We're just outlining 5 different ways. And the governor did nothing. And I shouldn't even say he did nothing. Because when presented with each of these opportunities and each of this on-ramps, he just kept right on cruising down the freeway of paying out money to fraudsters. That's the reality. And that's what he needs to answer to Minnesotans.
We got time for one more.
You mentioned something before about the governor telling you about this during the legislative session. Was that, or that's part of some of the hearings, or was that like in a negotiations meeting?
It was in a negotiations meeting, and I don't remember the exact timing, but he mentioned it. He said, oh, just, you're gonna hear about this. There's a court case going on. It was when it was in court. And that's really all I remember about it. You know, he basically said, we caught this fraud and we're, you know, it's in court right now and they're trying to, or something. They're trying to, you know, you're gonna see about it in the news. It might have been the investigation, actually, that the investigation had started.
I think
So
it was right before they did the raids.
Yeah.
the raids? Yeah, I think that was the timing on it. So it was towards the end of this last legislative session, right before they did that. Yeah, so anyways, it is a big deal. You know, and it's not politics, this isn't about an election, but the election is relevant because the fact that the governor thinks he can not answer questions about his involvement in the largest fraud scandal in state history when he has directly lied to the public about it multiple times, you know, 3 weeks before an election, and that he doesn't have to answer any questions, is absolutely irresponsible. And we are demanding that the governor answer those questions. Number one, when did you know about it? And number two, why did you not stop it when presented with these 5 opportunities to stop paying out this money? And ultimately, the governor could have prevented $200 million plus from being wasted, which we will likely never recover. And frankly, I think Minnesotans deserve answers. So, all right, thank you, everybody.